We are lucky to have him here today to give our keynote speech. Eric Asimov.
Thank you so much. I know I look young, but I've really been writing about food and wine since 1989. So it's been a while. I'm so happy to be here, and I've been so encouraged by the presentations that we heard this morning. I think that reusable bottles has got to be the wave of the future, and I know that there have been some dismal experiments in New York City that didn't go very far, so I'm glad to see that this seems to be picking up momentum. And I was fascinated by Patty's presentation. It reminded me of my first trip to Piemonte, to the Barolo region, almost 25 years ago. And this was still the time of the conventional wisdom about yield management. And I remember talking to a woman, an older woman who basically farmed a Nebbiolo vineyard. And she said to me, "This is such nonsense. Every vineyard has its balance. Every vine has its balance. And that's what you have to look for. It's not the lowest. You don't want the highest. You want each vine to find its place." And I've sort of believed that ever since. You can never underestimate the arrogance of wine writers, and I'm taking a risk saying this, to tell growers and winemakers what they ought to be doing. Hopefully I can avoid that. And it's great to be in Oregon. A few years ago, I wrote that Oregon was the single most exciting region in the United States, state in the US, for wine. And I still believe that. There's so much going on. I know Willamette Pinot Noir dominates the discussion, but the Chardonnays are so good. And the experimentation that's going on with other grapes, Gamay, Chenin Blanc, grapes like that, and beyond the Willamette, the Applegate valleys, Rogue Valley in the south, the Columbia River Gorge is making fascinating wines. So really happy to be out here once again. I wanted to begin with a story that my father told me about when he was young. My father's family, my paternal grandparents, emigrated from the Soviet Union in the mid-20s. My grandfather had been a grain dealer there, and they settled in Brooklyn. My father was born there. He was the last of 3 children and the first one to be born in this country. And he grew up there. My grandparents ran a candy store, and my father, if he was not in school, was either working at the candy store or playing ball in the streets. And throughout his childhood, he never left New York City, barely left Brooklyn. It wasn't really until he went to college at NYU, all the way in Manhattan, that he had an opportunity to leave the city for the first time. A classmate who lived in Westchester, which we call upstate. Back then, it was kind of a semi-rural place. Now it's just another bedroom community. But a classmate invited him up to his house, went up to Westchester. There's a house with all this land around it, and they're walking around, and there's a vegetable patch there. And this was the first vegetable patch that my father had ever seen, and the family was very proud of it. And his friend reaches down, grabs a carrot, and lifts it up. And my father was horrified. He said, "From the dirt?" And it just showed how alienated one generation in the city can become from nature, from farming, agriculture, from knowing where a vegetable comes from. So my parents, like many people in the 1950s, my mom was also from Brooklyn. They left the city, they moved to the suburbs thinking that this was a better place to raise their family. And so I grew up in a suburb. We had land. My mother had a vegetable garden. So it was not a mystery to me where the food on my plate came from. I went to a summer camp, I hiked, I canoed, I learned campcraft. I had a basic idea of the natural world, but then I moved to New York City, and I've lived in Manhattan the last 40 years, and except for that small experience, I basically have shared my father's alienation from this world. I've worked at the New York Times for almost 40 years, 35 years on the food and wine team. And I spent the 90s reviewing restaurants. And there I learned, I had a first-hand seat at the food and wine revolution that was overtaking the country. I learned the importance of good ingredients if you wanted to eat well. I learned about good wine and how it could enhance a meal and became somewhat fluent with it. But like most Americans, I really had little connection to the natural world, what many of you here interact with every day and take for granted. It wasn't until I became a wine critic 20 years ago that I began to travel to wine regions around the world and walk into vineyards and talk to farmers and get at least a small sense of what happens in a growing area, how it all works. And I did this repeatedly, and it came to be essentially a 20-year intensive course in vineyards and in nature, in the natural world. And I didn't realize the importance of these experiences to me until the COVID-19 pandemic came. And we were locked down in Manhattan. And probably like many of you, I had to cancel a number of trips that I had planned to France, to Italy, to Greece, to California, Oregon, upstate New York, and Vermont. All of these places I was planning to go to have these experiences, to visit farmers and winemakers, to walk in the vineyards and just breathe in the air there. It was no accident that most of the vineyards that I chose to go to were either organic, biodynamic, or sustainable in whatever way the farmers deemed was appropriate to their pieces of land. I had, a long time ago, come to believe that the best wines came from the vineyards that were farmed most conscientiously. I bought the cliche that wine is made in the vineyard, that people in the wine business say all the time, so much so that it became somewhat meaningless. But I believe that. And this was not a dogmatic or ideological position for me. I've had wonderful wines that have come from chemically farmed vineyards, some of the greatest wines I've ever had. But I always wondered whether they would be more complex, purer, more energetic, and more complete if the vineyards they came from had been farmed with more sensitivity. Now, for most of this time, walking in vineyards for me was merely an enjoyable professional obligation. A lot of my colleagues, wine writers, used to say that all that matters was what was in the glass. And I never believed that. I never wanted to divorce the wine from the place in which it grew, from the people who made the wine, from the traditions and the culture in that area. And it became very important to me. And in that pandemic lockdown period, I began to realize how invested I had been in these small connections I had with nature. And what I experienced was almost a visceral, physical withdrawal of being in this proverbial concrete jungle, except for occasional trips to Central Park. It reminded me of when I was in graduate school at University of Texas at Austin. And having grown up in New York and in the suburb, I was always within 15 minutes of the Atlantic Ocean. Moving to Texas, I was sort of landlocked, an hour and a half from the Gulf of Mexico. And I had no idea that I had this unconscious attachment to the ocean, but I began to feel claustrophobic there. It was like a physically strange feeling, and that was now repeating itself in this prolonged period in New York City. And I missed the intimate relationship that I observed enlightened farmers having with the land they tend. And most of these vineyards that I came to cherish were not carefully manicured showpieces. They were wild and unruly, or at least as wild and untamed as a human construct could be. And they were places where farmers nursed ideals, in my interpretation, of disturbing the natural qualities and biodiversity of a place as little as possible. And this regular schooling in the intricacies of the natural world over time made me feel personally the complexities of a healthy ecosystem, from the network of microbial life under the ground to the biodiversity above, right up to the apex predator in an area. And I had never really thought about this until I was being interviewed by some publication during the pandemic through Zoom. And the interviewer asked me what was the most important thing that I had ever gotten from my years covering wine. And I said, without thinking, it's my connection to nature. And he was taken aback. He said, really? I thought you were going to mention all the rare old wines that you've had access to, or the people that you've been able to discuss things with, the famous winemakers and people like that. And of course, that's a privilege of my job. But it was really this connection to nature that I never had and never even knew that I needed, that had come to me through wine. And I thought about this more, and I realized that this relationship with the natural world, my relationship with it, had fostered ideas of idealism and romance and hope. And it showed me the interconnectedness of all things including a glass of wine, which I had never really known about before or sensed before. To me, it was the absolute beauty of nature and its arrangement. In some people with a different frame of mind, it could have been evidence of the hand of the creator. But I had this feeling. And I thought maybe this is an example of biophilia. There's a little art exhibit about biophilia right in the lobby here. But that's a notion popularized by the naturalist Edward Wilson. And it says that humans possess an innate love of nature. I just had never realized it until this developing sense that I had was taken away. And I felt desperate to be in a vineyard, to smell the earth, to walk in a forest or dip my toes in a stream. And I owed this consciousness entirely to wine. If it hadn't been for my years covering wine, I would have perceived dirt the same way that my father had with his carrot, rather than seeing it as this complex web of interrelated living things. I would never have known that you can't just look at vines to gauge the healthfulness of a vineyard, but that you really have to look at the entire ecosystem above and below ground. And you learn what's missing as well as what's there. Now, at this point, I imagine that some people here are saying, what is this romantic nonsense that he's spouting? What does it have to do with the real business of wine? Well, I am romantic about wine, and I don't mind admitting it. You all know how the sausage gets made here, but I'm a consumer. I call myself the world's greatest dilettante because I travel around the world and I parachute into different places and in a very short order have to absorb a lot of knowledge and spew it out again in the newspaper. So what I know is fairly wide but incredibly shallow. But I come to wine really as a consumer. And we all know that you sell wine, or wine can be sold, partly through romance. But I don't consider it soft or unrealistic to be romantic about wine. I don't think that it lacks rigor. I think that romance is the essence of wine, at least from the consumer's point of view. Wine, to me, is good wine, I'm talking about. It's mysterious and unknowable. We don't really know how it evolves over time in a barrel, in a bottle, in a glass over minutes. Why do some bottles evolve beautifully and get complex and wonderful, and the same bottle of wine, nothing happens to it? I mean, these are all crazy things about wine, and maybe they're frustrating to people who want a consistent processed product. But to me, this is the beauty of wine, and one of the reasons that I keep coming back to it. For me, great wine, like nature, arouses a sense of wonder. It's not just a beautiful beverage, but it's a symbol of nature and of culture. And in today's world, I think the symbolic power of wine and its binding tie to nature can be a powerful and beneficial tool. Now, Everybody in this room knows a lot better than I do the most obvious manifestations of climate change. You've all lived through the fires and drought, heat and killer frosts. We've all seen once-in-a-lifetime events become commonplace. And you know more about the nuanced changes as well. The disappearance of the familiar flora and fauna in a particular place, and the appearance of stuff that was never there before. There have been minute changes in the growing cycle every year, and big changes as well. And we've all seen the projections of the next 50 years if climate change goes unchecked. Even if we can't meet the modest goals of the Paris Accords, and by most calculations, the biggest producers of greenhouse gases, including our country, are going to miss those marks by a long way. And in many people I've talked to about climate change, there's a sense of fatalism about it and hopelessness. And I felt that way myself. I felt that, what can we do as individuals or small businesses? It's like a task for Sisyphus. You keep pushing the boulder up the hill, and it keeps rolling back down on you. And it's true that nothing the wine industry does in isolation is really going to affect the larger arc of climate change. What we need are political leaders to make it a priority. They have to declare climate change a public health emergency, as governments did with tobacco many years ago. And this requires that voters see climate change as urgent and that demand that politicians make it a priority. But this too seems like a Sisyphean task in our divided country, where even the most vital pieces of legislation fall prey to political games or quest for profits. And American voters as well, like politicians, have their mind on short-term matters, like the price of gasoline, for example, which, if you're concerned about climate change, seems absurd that should be more meaningful to people than what a politician is going to do about climate change. But that's where we are. And yet I remind myself that every little bit helps, and every little bit, every collective action is made of small actions. Gandhi famously said, "Whatever you do will be insignificant, but it is very important that you do it." So it's important to remind ourselves that what we do individually and as small businesses matters a lot more than we think, because these actions do add up. And I think this is where the tie between wine and nature comes in. Wine's symbolic power gives it a singular role to play in the fight against climate change. It teaches us that agriculture and the benefits, it teaches about agriculture and the benefits and consequences of different agricultural practices. And wine can inspire conversations in ways that other agricultural products cannot. You can take a great head of lettuce or a delicious strawberry that's been beautifully farmed, but it doesn't these products don't inspire the same sense of wonder and mystery. Nobody is going to inquire about the farming, the soils, the other practices beyond asking at the farmer's market whether it was farmed organically or not. And it's really only through wine that most people have become familiar with terms like biodynamic or regenerative. Through wine, people develop at least a modest idea of geology, soil science, and biodiversity. The reason is that good wine is the most visible and meaningful agricultural product that many people will encounter. And wine has the power to educate people about agriculture and climate change. And wine, I believe, needs to harness this power and make good use of it. So why is this important? We know that agriculture is responsible for a sizable percentage of the greenhouse gases emitted each year. Some estimates put it at 25%. Viticulture, though just a tiny part of the agricultural chain, is important beyond its numbers in any discussion of agriculture and climate change. What people learn about farming and nature through wine can inspire deeper discussions that can lead to greater awareness about agriculture and its role in the climate. Mimi Castile, who is a good friend to many people in this room, who's right here, once told me, wine in this sense is a gateway to environmentalism and therefore to a discussion about climate change and how humans can act to combat it. For people who are serious about wine, it is often their takeoff point into a world of farming and agriculture that they otherwise would have known little about. The problem is that people don't naturally make these connections themselves. We have to do it for them. I have to do it as a journalist and writer, and the wine industry needs to do a better job of persuading people that wine is a natural agricultural product. Too many people see wine as simply another product on a supermarket shelf, and we need to remind them over and over again that wine is an agricultural product. It's a farmed drink. It's not a processed food. And only after people make this leap do they begin to ask the important questions about where wine came from and how it was farmed and how it was made. And this is when the light bulbs begin to go off and they no longer see wine as simply a store-bought product, but a result of a long chain of events and decisions about farming and production. The problem is how to educate and persuade the public and how to realize this power that wine has. And it requires the wine industry, as individuals in this room, but also as small businesses, to do whatever it can to improve its stewardship of the earth. It means embracing all manifestations of sustainability, not just in farming, but in the winery, whether that means improving water and energy efficiency, waste management, or packaging, as our friends from Ravino outlined earlier today. It also means social sustainability. I was going to use the words DEI and so on, but our gentleman with the poster over there made me think that I might be accused of being part of the woke mob if I use such loaded language. And social sustainability seems, at the moment, neutral, even if one day somebody's going to fix on that and try to demonize it as well. All of this is in the interest of the planet, of course, but it's also in the interest of wine. The last few years, there's been a lot of hand-wringing over younger people, and they're not doing their share in buying enough wine. How should the industry appeal to millennials and Gen Z? I hear this over and over again. Rob McMillan of the now infamous Silicon Valley Bank writes a State of the Wine Industry report every year, and he's been sounding this alarm for a long time. And for a while, I used to think that the solutions that his report proposed were kind of lame. You know, he was saying, well, we need a better marketing slogan like "Got Milk" or something like that. And to me, that was not a very convincing strategy. But in his last report, he said that he believed young people were far more concerned with social justice and health and environmental issues than boomers ever were. He said, quote, "A brand's social values are increasingly connected to a consumer's decision to purchase particular products, including wine." And I believe that. From my little urban corner of the world, I see an awful lot of young people drinking wine. They're sitting in wine bars, small restaurants. All of these places have lists that are dominated by natural wine. And what is it that younger people are drawn to there? I don't think it's just fashion. I think that these wines, aside from often being delicious, meet these social and environmental concerns that a lot of young people have, including my two millennial sons. I'm not suggesting that everybody here should become a natural wine producer overnight. It's just that we have to do a better job of communicating the idea that wine is an agricultural product, that wine is committed to farming and producing wine in the most environmentally sound ways, the most socially just ways, the most responsible in terms of energy, water, and waste management, and is truly concerned with shrinking its carbon footprint. In this way, wine can be highly influential in setting an example for the larger culture. And it's really good for business, too, I think. Now, the best way to maximize this remarkable platform that wine occupies, I think, and I'm going to repeat myself here, it's raising awareness about agricultural products, wine particularly, and using it as a vehicle for discussions about farming, about soil and water, about biodiversity, and the natural world. For so long, wine tended to market itself as almost an art form, as part of what Robert Mondavi used to call the good life, which basically was white people in a pastoral setting in some kind of mythical pseudo-Mediterranean setting. But we need to take wine off the pedestal and bring it back down to earth. I think we all know that wine is a very intimidating, anxiety-producing beverage for people. confronted with all of the language associated with wine and so on. I think if it's grounded as an agricultural product, and we talk about the real processes that go into making good wine, it will also help to alleviate some of this sense of intimidation that so many people seem to feel. Now, this also is going to require honesty in the wine industry. Wine can talk about ways that it's shrunk its carbon footprint, but it also needs to talk about ways that it has not and what it can do that's better. For example, we talked a little bit about transport of wine around the country earlier. But so much wine is shipped around the world in incredibly wasteful ways for pointless reasons. There's a lot of inexpensive wine that is shipped in bottles. The wine is bottled at the point at the source, shipped halfway around the world and sold to people there. Why can't we ship wine, especially inexpensive wine, commodity wine, in bulk and bottle it closer to the target market? That would save an awful lot of energy, and it's not a new idea either. It's a very old idea. That's how wine used to be shipped for most of history. If you have ever had a really old Bordeaux in the UK, going the 60s or earlier, chances are that that bottle is going to have on its label not just the name of the chateau that produced it, it's going to have the name of the merchant, the British merchant who bottled it. Because these wines used to be shipped in barrels and then bottled right near the target market by the merchants. It's an old idea. And I see a little bit of this. I see Australia, for example, is sending wine in bulk to the UK now, and it's being bottled then. Alternative packaging as well. That makes all the sense in the world for wine that's meant to be drunk within a year, which is the vast majority of wine. We also have to discuss what makes wine different from other products, in the sense that, you know, our ethos is now eat local, drink local. And some of the most disciplined farm-to-table restaurants are serving wines from halfway around the world. And I'm not going to take issue with that, because I want to drink those wines too. But what is it about wine that makes it, some of its products, worthy of this sort of wasteful transport? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not worthy. But it's a discussion to have. Not everything in wine or in climate can be solved with a single decisive act or a series of decisive acts. But we have to commit ourselves to examining wine's practices honestly. And we have to make as a cornerstone of good wine environmentalism, concern for the earth, social justice. And I don't think there's a downside to this. The pandemic proved that we can change, and change fast if we have to. The pandemic did not allow procrastination. Many people in this room probably depended on tasting room sales, and suddenly you had to pivot to direct to consumer, and you did it, and it worked, maybe even more than you thought it could. I think the same commitment is required from all of us now, because climate change does not seem immediate. There's always something more important, a higher priority. Climate change seems down the road, but in agricultural, in geological time, it really is already the last minute. I think we can do all these changes, not because I've seen enormous commitment to doing it, but we have to do it. We have to change because we have no choice. Thank you very much for listening to me drone on, and if you have any questions, happy to answer them.
You talked about what I would call transparency in wine. Talk a little bit about the whole hubbub going on about labeling requirements and transparency issues from a consumer standpoint on that issue.
I absolutely believe that the more transparent wine can be about its ingredients and practices, the better off we will all be. I don't really care about the labeling wine with nutritional values. That's somewhat irrelevant to me. But I very much want to know the ingredients that go into wine and the processing that it's undergone. I know that a lot of people in wine have made the argument that these are not, these are somewhat mysterious and not, they may convey the wrong idea about wine to ignorant consumers, but I would just say, look at the ingredients of breakfast cereal, and who is that discouraged from buying, millions of boxes of Cheerios? I think the people to whom it's meaningful, I'm one of them, really care about this, and we're forced to seek out our information in other ways. And it's, as I was saying, wine can distinguish itself as one of the least processed beverages out there, certainly compared to other alcoholic beverages. And why not use this opportunity to demonstrate how natural it can be?
So you travel all over the world, and I'm just curious, what winemaking regions in the world do you think have the most cutting-edge sustainability practices, and what can we learn from them?
Well, certainly there are areas in Europe that are far more sustainable than most places in the United States. As was detailed this morning, the percentage of glass that's recycled is far greater than in the US and many parts of Europe. I had no idea that Germany already had a reusable bottle program that was quite advanced, and I've got to get some more information about that. But there are places where you have close to 100% in terms of organic farming. And I think, nowadays that's maybe a little bit, the benefit of that is a little bit overstated as people debate whether organic is necessarily more sustainable than other forms of farming. But it shows a commitment, and maybe it also demonstrates that certain climates and certain regions it's easier to do this sort of farming. But Bordeaux used to claim that because it was a coastal region, a humid region, it was impossible to farm organically there now. And now the best estates are all flocking to be able to claim they're organic or biodynamic. I'm not sure that really answers your question, but I think that there are places all over the world who are more advanced just in terms of their sustainability practices. I'm not necessarily talking about farming, because I have seen a lot of progress in the United States.
You've spoken about the sustainability and the conversation around climate change. Can you touch on the temperance movement, the World Health Organization, and potentially the FDA, where they will go with alcoholic beverage claims?
Yeah, this is a sore point. I have never been one to claim health benefits for wine or for any alcoholic beverages. I think that it just rings of desperation on the part of a beverage that offers so many pleasures, but healthfulness is not necessarily one of them. And I have the same hesitancy about any sort of food that claims to be healthful, because it's never just one food. It's never like, if you cut this out of your diet, you're good. And if you add that to your diet, you're great. I mean, that's all marketing, I'm afraid. I believe entirely in the proverbial moderation in all things. At the same time, the World Health Organization report was so wrong-headed, so ridiculous. Not only has it been shown that a lot of the studies it was based on, and Catherine Cole, who's somewhere in this room, just wrote an article for Decanter about this that I would urge you all to read. But it almost, it's an illogical demand that anything be 100% healthful. I mean, why don't we read a WHO report on fast food burgers or French fries or getting in a car? I mean, all kinds of things that the minute you eat a burger or get in a car, you're taking a risk. And I think that all adults, riding a bicycle in a city, it's dangerous. Some people say it's healthful, though. So, adults make adult decisions about what they want to do in their life, and hopefully they're making informed decisions based on their health, and they are moderate in their ways. And I think that, some sort of retort will be required, and I am hoping that somewhere somebody is planning another study or another published report that will take issue with the World Health Organization and at least bring a little bit more sense to this issue.
Sparkling wine has become the new hot thing in Oregon. And I just read an article about the perfect pairing of champagne and fried chicken. So can you settle the question?
I wrote that.
Original recipe or extra crispy?
I don't know. Does that apply to Popeyes? I don't know. I wrote this article after going to this new restaurant in New York that specializes in Korean fried chicken, which if you've never had it, it's wonderful. And they also have one of the greatest champagne and sparkling wine lists that I've seen in a restaurant, including 100 sparkling wines under $100, which nowadays, to find any champagne under $100 in a restaurant wine list in New York City is kind of miraculous. So yeah, I'm all for sparkling wine and all fried things.